Let's talk straight talk. I can hear you talking.
Straight talk live.
Did I hear you say? Did I hear you say straight talk? Did I hear you say? Did I hear you say
Straight talk live.
talking straight? Did I hear you say
Straight talk.
with Edna?
Straight talk live.
Talking straight. Let's talk straight talk. I can hear you talking.
Straight talk live.
Did I hear you say
Straight talk.
Edna?
Straight talk live.
Talking straight. I can hear you talking.
Straight talk live.
Talking straight. Did I hear you say straight talk? With Edna.
Straight talk live.
I can hear you talking.
Straight talk live. Straight talk.
With Edna.
Straight talk live.
Talking straight.
Straight talk.
Let's talk.
Good morning and welcome to Straight Talk Live. I'm your host, Edna Howell Paris. Good morning. Wake up, Cincinnati. I know it's Bengals Day. We got a lot more going on than Cincinnati Bengals, but that's a big time, and we hope you do celebrate and have a good time and be safe as well. Go Bengals. Who they? That's what they say. Who they? Come on in and join us this morning as we talk about the issue of the week. Black History Month. Yeah, it's Black History Month, and the history is rolling in. It continues. People are talking about Whoopi Goldberg. She was wrong and she was right. Whoopi Goldberg, right on Jews not being erased, wrong on the Holocaust. It's not just the Holocaust that Whoopi Goldberg got wrong. The cure for her ignorance is education, some say, and not a dose of cancer or cancel culture. Did Whoopi Goldberg's public history lesson actually do some good? Maybe it could. Goldberg's comments reflect a growing national ignorance about the Holocaust. What happens next? Could it be a model for how we move forward? Good morning. Let's talk. Reading some headlines about our girl, Whoopi Goldberg, and what happened. Well, what did happen? And why was she right and why was she wrong? Well, on The View, January 30th, Whoopi Goldberg and her cohorts were talking about the cancellation of a book called Mouse. Yep, they were talking about it, and it was about Jewish history and Jewish culture, and about an author who decided to write a book about his father's experience during the Holocaust. And this book is what, 10, 15, 20 years old? And so then Whoopi made her comments. Now, what I think as a host of a show myself, if I was to just go on the air and just give my opinion on something without having done some refresher courses on it, I probably could say something that I really didn't intend on saying. So I want to remind you this morning that our opinions on the show this morning are based upon uh, what I believe as a host, what my guest believes, and not that of Cincinnati Digital Media. And that no harm is intended for anyone whose feelings may get hurt. We don't want that to happen either. But Whoopi Goldberg got in trouble. Now, all the headlines that I read were from opinion pieces, and the LA Times had one that I thought was pretty good. They talked about Whoopi Goldberg, why she's in trouble. The editorial says that she insisted that the Holocaust was not about race, that it was instead an example of white on white violence. Sounds interesting. She was accused of both minimizing and misunderstanding the Holocaust. In ABC, that's the network the view is on, they suspended her after she even gave an apology. Um, some people say education, teach, so we know. So that's what we're doing this morning, and it's part of Black history because there is a connection. Believe me, there is a connection. The Nazis very much saw Jews as an inferior race. Now, that's what commentators say that Goldberg got suspended for, because she said it wasn't about race, it was about white on white violence. Okay, we'll hold that one. They saw Jews as an inferior race, the Nazis did, and one that needed to be eradicated, done away with. European racial scientists consider Jews to be biologically different from Aryan, Nordic, or German people. But Whoopi Goldberg did get something right, according to the editorial. She said what race means in Europe and the United States was not identical. Despite their false claims that Jews were physically different, Nazi policymakers feared that Jews could pass as white. Indeed, it was precisely why they constituted such a grave threat. Nazi propaganda emphasized that when Eastern European or Orthodox Jews shaved off their beards, some could pass undetected into politics, business, and entertainment, as well as the women into the arms of the Aryan men. They said that would have corrupted the German race and its culture. That's the end of that LA Times op ed. So, who better to talk about that issue than our friend coming on for his quarterly visit, the one and only Professor Dr. John McClendon III, joining us today to discuss the facts about the Holocaust. Why was it not about whites killing whites and the relationship between uh, Jews and white people, Aryans, people in Germany? Who was Adolf Hitler and what did he have to do with that whole issue? Well, Dr. John is here this morning. Dr. John McClendon is a professor at Michigan State University in the Department of Philosophy. Dr. John has a number of books and a lot of interests, so we won't even go into all that. But Dr. John, we want to welcome you this morning to Straight Talk Live. Good morning.
Good morning. I'm very happy to be here, excuse me, to share with you on this very important Black History Month event. Of course, race plays a pivotal role in our understanding of Black history. And so when we think about Black history, of course, we think about Black people, which designates a racial identity. So when we look at Black history, we're looking at the issue of race and racism, which plays a central part, not just in the United States, but all over the world. And this is important for us to understand because in the slave trade, all of Europe was engaged in the slave trade. Not some of Europe, but all of Europe was engaged in the slave trade. And what we know with respect to what becomes the United States of America is a very curious concept called settler colony. And the notion of a settler colony corresponds with European expansionism. So not only is the United States in its origins as a settler colony to be included, but of course we know Canada, we know Australia, we know South Africa. And so when we begin to look at the notion of settler colonies and how indigenous people are treated, that becomes a very significant issue of race and nationality, where national oppression assumes the group that is indigenous to a territory is an inferior race. So, how is that important then for our understanding of race? Is that we know full well that the category of race is a social category, but it has as a part of its definition something called phenotypic description. So, in the case of the United States, you would identify someone that would have a phenotype of a certain character that would point, of course, to Africa. That phenotype would be characterized as black rather than white. Now, we know that there are black people who are, in fact, phenotypically indistinguishable from white people. Homer Plessy, who recently the decision was made to take him away from being a criminal. You may have seen that in the news recently that now Homer Plessy has been vindicated. But Homer Plessy was 7/8 white. So in the United States, then, race was not just a matter of phenotype, it was a question of how do you maintain white supremacy in an absolute sense. And of course, the Plessy decision, which anchored what became Jim and Jane Crow, it was important then that even someone like Homer Plessy not be granted the rights that were given to people who were considered to be white. Now, I say all of that because if you think about race when you go to South Africa, the same Homer Plessy would not be considered black, he would be considered colored in the days of apartheid. And so in South Africa, the same person who was black in the United States could become colored in South Africa and then travel to Brazil and be identified as white. Because in Brazil, your class status corresponded to your racial status. So the soccer superstar, Pele, was officially considered white, though he was as dark as I am or
Yes,
anyone
yes.
else. So the complexity around race is important to understand, and I think that Whoopi Goldberg was unfairly attacked because of that. Because the complexity of race is not even settled among Jews themselves. Some Jews argue that being a Jew is a matter of race. And they take biblical mythology as the basis for arguing that Jewish people are one people. And in fact, in terms of Israel, there's something called the law of return, which says that anyone who identifies as a Jew can return to Israel. Now, who's returning and who was there? It's based upon a mythic presentation with respect to the history of that area, because, excuse me, Palestine has existed since 500 BCE. All right? Palestine, in fact, was a part of what was called the Ottoman Turkish Empire. And being a part of the Ottoman Turkish Empire, they were held in subjugation by the Turks until the British were able to take control of the area. And then it became what was called a mandate of Britain, which is a fancy word for a colony of Britain. Now, but it was called Palestine, not Israel. It didn't become Israel until 1948. Who were the people who existed in Palestine? Well, in fact, there existed groups of people who were ethnically Arab and groups of people who were ethnically Jew. Well, let's look at that. Is Judaism a religion or is it an ethnicity? Well, we know when we look across the globe there are many non-European Jews who are not, in fact, and do not, in fact, consider themselves to be white. So if you go to India, if you go to the Caribbean, if you go to Africa, if you go to India, if you go to China, if you go to Korea, you will find Jews who are not European. So, how do we then determine, with respect to Whoopi Goldberg's comments, whether she was right or wrong when she says, I saw this as a white on white issue rather than a race issue? Well, let's go back. In your earlier remarks, you brought out a very important point with respect to how Hitler developed this notion of the Aryan race, which was designed not just to include the oppression of those who were Jews in Germany, but also to expand throughout Europe. And we know World War II was a fight that went throughout Europe all the way into the Soviet Union. And there were many Soviets who died in the fight against Nazism. In fact, the Soviet Union was the last stage, the last obstacle to Nazi expansionism, and the Soviets defeated that with hundreds of thousands of people dying in that cause. Of course, what becomes important then is that when we look at the question of Hitler's notion of the Aryan race, it didn't just pop up in the 1930s. In fact, Francis Galton, you should know that name, Francis Galton, who was a cousin of Charles Darwin, is the person responsible for developing a notion of classifying races wherein he argued that Jews were a race. And he developed, in fact, a number of images, photographs, where he tried to describe the phenotype of Jews. Now we know, remember we said Jews are in India, Jews are in Africa, Jews are in the Caribbean, Jews are in Asia, Jews are all over the world. So how can you develop a phenotype for what is in fact a multiracial group? So when we begin to think in terms of race, what Galton attempted to do was to racialize Jewish people. And that presumption is what Hitler used. So what's the point? The point is that the false notion that Jews are race does not in fact dictate that they are so. It's a false classification that has to be challenged rather than embraced. So the question is, why should someone embrace something which is utterly false? That Galton, who developed this whole field of study, and by the way, he played a very important role in terms of US racism and how Black people were seen in terms of the US, as well as what he had to say about Jews. So we talk about that in our book on African American philosophers. But in any case, what becomes significant then is that if we presume that Hitler had a false proposition, why then do we take a false proposition and argue that since Hitler thought Jews were a race, then what Hitler did in the Holocaust is a matter of racism? If that is a false presumption, then we should understand full well there can be other bases in which, in fact, the logic of the argument is grounded in. For example, if you go to Pakistan today and you go to India today, you will see people who phenotypically look identical. But why is there a Pakistan and why is there an India today? Well, there was the question of Hinduism and Islam. Pakistan is a state established around Islam. India is a state which is established around Hinduism. So when Muslims talk about being oppressed by Hindus, and in fact, it's currently going on right now in India. The head of state of India, who was closely, excuse me, aligned to Donald Trump, uh, is a very hardcore Hinduist. And remember that this whole idea of Hindu identity and being associated with Muslims was a very intense question. It even led to the assassination of Mahatma Gandhi, who we all know influenced a great many Black thinkers, from Howard Thurman to Martin Luther King to Mordecai Johnson to William Stewart Nelson and so many others. So when we think about the fact that there are people within the Hindu group, right wingers, who thought that Gandhi was too soft with respect to Muslims, and they assassinated him. Now, let's presume that someone would come along and say that Hindus are a race. And so, therefore, Hindu oppression of Muslims amounts to racism. Well, we would know that would be a false proposition, even though some Hindus may even make such an argument. So, we have to understand very clearly that when Whoopi made that statement, she wasn't wrong, but she was stepping on some toes, mainly those who are Zionists who want to argue that Israel is one people with the right to return to Palestine with no restrictions.
Before
Whereby,
before
mhm.
you go on, I want to just introduce our guests this morning and thank them for tuning in to us. Brandy Waddell is here. Holly Jenkins, we have her. She said good morning to everyone. We have Joyce Keith and Deja McClendon is here this morning. Okay, thank you, Deja. Good morning, Miss Edna from Jeannie Mulholland with her bingo sign. Good morning, everyone from Gladysville. Deja's here again. Cleopatra Jones, Nazippo Glenn. Hey, Nazippo, long time no hear from. Cleopatra Jones, the original Jews, Hebrews. These are Ashkenazis and never stepped foot into Israel until May of 1948. That's a good year. We got to talk about that. Thanks, Maurice, because we're going to talk about that as well, Dr. John. And the Zippo is back. And the Zippo, thank you so much for joining us this morning. Maurice said the Negroes would be the copper colored people in America. Good morning to me from everybody. And good morning, Dr. John. And Deja says good morning. Brittany O'Neill, thank you for jumping in. And we really appreciate you. The whole issue about Whoopi Goldberg and what she said. Let's go back to the division between Palestine and Israel. Now, the Jewish people, did they have their own homeland at one time? And were they trying to come in and kind of take over Palestine? Why was there always war in the Middle East and such upheaval?
Well, you again, you have to go back. Excuse me. Palestine had existed since 500 BC, BCE.
BCE.
Okay. Now that's important. That's before the Common Era, BCE. So the Jews who were leaving Germany and later the Soviet Union to go to Israel were never historically tied to the land of Palestine. There were Jews in Palestine before 1948 who did not migrate to Palestine, that were indigenous, as well as the Arabs who were indigenous to Palestine. And there was no wars between them. There was no strife between them. But the Zionist movement, once the idea as I mentioned earlier, that was a minority idea among Jews. And still today, there are segments of Jews who are anti Zionist. So it's very important to understand that being anti Zionist is not restricted to people who are non Jews. So the claim that one is against Zionism is the same as being anti Semitic would include a large segment of Jews who, from a religious standpoint, opposes Zionism. That's very important. At the same time, from a religious standpoint, evangelical Christian Zionists support the Israeli state because, in their view, these are people who were normally Trump supporters and why Trump made the move to recognize Jerusalem as the capital rather than Tel Aviv. That was an important move. Why? Because initially in 1948, Jerusalem was not considered in the United Nations plan for what was to be the Israeli state, that Jerusalem would be a part of that. Jerusalem, since it had religious significance for both Muslims and Jews, was to be without any influence of either group as kind of neutral ground. So why would Trump then say, we want to push for Jerusalem as the capital? Well, you can see directly that this is why the evangelical Christians argue from a religious standpoint that only when the Jews return to Jerusalem will we see the second coming of Jesus. And this would fulfill biblical prophecy. So that's why you find a strong evangelical Christian Zionist group who avidly support the state of Israel.
But the Jews can't go back. I mean, they can't go back home, and Jews are more than just the people that were from that Middle East area. Like you say, they're from China, from India. They're African Jews. They're Jews of all colors and all colors. Now, are they talking about the original Jews, Abraham's children?
Well, I'm going to step up some toes here, I know, but I'll cite some Jewish scholars who would be in support. Excuse me, the historian Carol Myers, who teaches at Duke University in the religious studies program, who is a Jew, argues that the whole story about Abraham and Moses and all of that cannot be historically verified. What it is Jewish mythology. It was written to consolidate the Jewish people around a myth. That's not rare. All people throughout the world have developed mythologies to consolidate their sense of group identity. If you go to Africa, you will find people who have their own mythologies around their particular groups. So how do we then take one group's mythology and hold it over at a higher level than another group? So let's take Greek mythology. They had their own mythology about their origins.
Absolutely.
And so Genesis is a mythic characterization, excuse me, not history. So you have to understand that, because even when it was written, it's written as if it all started with the Jews. But we know historically that's not a fact. We know historically there were other groups of people that preceded the Jews. And in fact, Jewish mythology, as we see it in Genesis, is taken from other influences as well. So if you understand even the Egyptian influence on the Genesis story. And so there's been a lot of Black scholars, for example, Dr. Ben Yakinen, who
Yes.
who was an Ethiopian Jew, talks about that extensively in all of his books. So the point is that Abraham Moses, Noah are mythic figures. So you can't use that as justification for why then you would come to a land and forcibly push the people out of that territory, the Palestinians, through assault, military assault, and massacre. And so that becomes important because just 1 month before the declaration that Israel would be a state in May of 1948, 1 month before that, there was a massacre of Palestinians in a village in which not only the men of the village, but the women and children were killed. And the Zionist leader of that time wrote, "We have destroyed the enemy and we will continue to do so." And the enemy wasn't another army, it was civilians who they murdered. And there's a lot of information. We're going to put on our Instagram page some information that people can utilize to read and study this.
Okay, there's a lot that we're going through, and I don't want to skip over the Holocaust. I want to talk about that and give people that don't understand or didn't understand or never even studied it a chance to get in on it. We want to welcome to the show this morning Cleopatra. She says the false notion is correct, Dr. John. Maurice Chapman again, for a person to be African American, they're saying they have citizenship to the dual citizenship to the continents of Africa and America. If they don't have documentation proving this, they are undocumented immigrants that can't be deported, according to Maurice. Deja McClendon says Roger and Sue are joining us too, John. I know you know who they are.
Hey, family.
All right. All right. Brittany O'Neill, glad to be here for this discussion. Hey, Dr. John, she says.
Hey,
Cleopatra.
Brittany.
Yeah, Cleopatra says, talk about it, Dr. John. Nazippo said, it's been a while, sister. Keep up the good work. I thank God for all that. I have my plans, but God orders my steps. You know that, girl. TC, good morning. Huday, good morning. We have Jeffrey Lynn Birch. He says, how are colored, Negro, brown skinned the only people in the world that can be ultimately against the violence and surround yourself with folks against violence and be assassinated? We are fragile people, and they trying to exterminate you in any way they can, whoever will do it, he says. Also, we want to welcome this morning Maurice again. He says, it was my ancestor who fought the Romans between 65 and 70 AD, not these white folks who are calling themselves us, like the oh, you talk about the Hamites. He said in the Chazon Revelation 2 and 9 and 3 and 9 about those who say they are Jew and are not, but are the synagogue of Satan. This is his words and not mine. Jesus is pagan, not my word. The scriptures say, when we return home, there will be no more wars. There are still wars, so they are not us. I have seen angels and heard Yah's voice, just like the scripture said he sounds. That's what he says this morning. We thank you. We have a lot of Bible scholars this morning. Maybe they disagree and maybe they agree. That's why we're here. You can join us and you can give us a call if you like. 513-873-7134. Replying to Maurice Chapman says Jeffrey Lynn Birch, Huday Chopper. Cleopatra says if Dr. McClendon tell people if you are stepping on their toes, move their feet out of the way. Good risings. A.R. Thompson says all. Ross speaks. Jeannie Mulholland, if Abraham and Moses were mythical biblical figures, then what makes the other characters in the Bible non-mythical? Good question. Dr. John.
Sure. Excuse me. First of all, I had a debate with a friend of mine who's a minister, and the debate centered on, excuse me, the movie about Noah, in which I forgot the actor. A noted white actor played Noah. It slips my mind now. Someone in the audience may remember the movie. And so we got into a debate over Noah should have been depicted as black. And so my point was that Noah, whether black or white, is a mythic figure. So it wasn't historically justified. It would be debating whether uh, Santa Claus was black or white. And we all know that Santa Claus is a mythic figure. Now, as to the question, if Abraham and Moses were mythical, then what makes the other characters in the Bible non mythical? Well, historians use what is known as biblical criticism, where they examine the text for its authenticity. That's right. Thank you. Russell Crowe did the Noah thing. Thank you, Deja. Thank you, Brittany. And so what we see here is that biblical scholars have long known that much of what is written in the Bible cannot be historically verified. Unfortunately, even ministers who have seminary training or have gone to academic institutions to get degrees know that, but they don't convey that to their congregations. They play along. Some of them are fearful that if they told them the truth, the congregations would get rid of them because this is a long sustaining commitment in terms of religious beliefs that people have. They grow up believing that, there was an Adam and Eve, and from Adam and Eve, they had two sons, one kills the other, and yet the one that survives meets somebody else and marries again. That doesn't make any sense. If there's only three people in the world, you can't meet anybody else. But in any event, if it's a myth, its role is what they call etiological. How do you explain the origins of things? And so people make up myths, just as the Greeks made up their myths, and they had their Jupiters and their Zeus and all the rest. Most of us would not take Greek mythology as history. We would simply say it was myth. But because those of us who grew up in a culture which was dominated by Christianity, then we take myth to be truth. So, what the historical profession, people who know the history of the Bible, understands that the Bible, in this case, the Hebrew Bible, because we have to be clear, Christians talk in terms of the Bible in the Hebrew Bible as the Old Testament, and then they talk in terms of a New Testament. Jews do not believe in a New Testament. So the idea for the Jews is this called the Hebrew Bible, and the first part of that, the first 5 books, said to be the books of Moses, which they weren't. Scholars know full well that when Moses wrote about his own death, there had to be something very unique going on there. It's mythology. And so scholars have pointed that out. Even the Exodus story, which plays a large part in the Zionist justification for invading and killing and dispersing the people of Palestine, that the Exodus story is a myth. In fact, there's a very important Jewish Israeli anthropologist and archaeologist by the name of Finkelstein. And he and another guy by the name of Silber wrote a book, Unearthing the Bible. And they did the archaeological work that showed that all these myths, including Joshua and Jericho, that never happened. The Exodus never happened. These are stories that solidify a group of people after the fact, centuries later, so that they can have a sense of where did we begin and how did we originate. And so that's why we can make that distinction between the mythological elements of the Bible from the historical elements. So
Absolutely.
through history and archaeology, you can demonstrate that.
Right. Cleopatra Jones says the Bible schools tell the preachers that the Bible is mythical. You are correct, she says. But we have to go back and reconstruct everything. What 3,000 years ago, ancient human history, the whole issue of who the true Jewish people were. So, if with all of that mythology, Hitler's brain that he had, and so believing that allegedly the Jews were the ones who allegedly killed Christ or said kill him or responsible for him, he took all that up on his shoulders to say that people from the Jewish faith, is it a faith or religion, that they are inferior and that they should be annihilated and killed. So the Holocaust was not a myth; it was true. How many Jews were killed? 6 million
Mm-hmm.
by Germany, Adolf Hitler and his cohorts.
Mm-hmm.
Sounds like a lot of Trumpism in there. That's where I think Trump. They said Trump wrote his rule book by what Hitler did. So all these people killed, taken into gas chambers, starved, put in what they call ghettos. All that done based upon mythism that the Aryans thought they were perfect people and they didn't want to be infiltrated with any other blood. They wanted their own. And then he hadn't, the man was crazy.
Well, see, that's why you have to understand race and racism because that happened here, the United States.
I know. If
They
If
accumulated
Native Americans could live today and tell it,
the myth of Thanksgiving.
yes,
If you really know the history behind that, then Thanksgiving is a part of a mythic representation of U.S. history.
yes,
Why do you think they're fighting against 1619 Project in critical race theory today? It's precisely because you dig down to the race's roots, and then you have to address that and not cover it over with notions that this has always been, quote, a democratic society in which all people are created equal. The guy who wrote the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson, was not only a slaveholder, he was a pedophile and had children by a young woman who he took with him to France.
yes,
And so what we have to and for years at the Jefferson plantation, they denied that until they did the DNA. And now if you go to the Jefferson plantation, they admit this fact. And for those of us who are in Ohio, a large segment of Jefferson's descendants moved to Wilberforce, Ohio,
yes.
and they still live there as descendants of Thomas Jefferson. But that was covered up.
Indeed,
So,
and in fact, we're going to have Shannon Lanier on, who would be maybe a quadruple uh, grandson of Thomas Jefferson.
mm,
And Shannon is, from Cincinnati, and so I'm going to have him on too to talk about that. I mean, these things have not been; these are facts. But if you believe critical race theory hurts people, it's only because maybe it's your guilt coming out.
well, a lot of it is not just guilt, is that people have been miseducated. Dr. Carter G. Woodson, the person who established what was then called Negro History Week in
Right.
1926, now Black History Month, wrote a very important book called The Miseducation of the Negro.
Hmm.
But not only did he speak of Black miseducation, which he thought was horrible, but he started the idea of Negro History Week, now Black History Month, as a way of educating white people with respect to their ignorance of Black history. And so a lot of the reaction is to the fact that people have been indoctrinated through generations. And so when they hear something different than what they've been indoctrinated with, they have a knee jerk reaction because their identities are established around that indoctrination. So, take for example, the um, national, excuse me, the national anthem. Francis Scott Key wrote the national anthem. And I talk about it in a piece that I wrote called On Black Lives Matter. I'll put that on my Instagram so people, the McClendon Report, then they can, go to it because it's been published in a book that just came out. But I point out that Francis Scott Key not only was a slaveholder, he was a lawyer who prosecuted abolitionists. He was also the brother-in-law of the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Taney, who gave the Dred Scott decision and said that a black man had no rights a white man was bound to respect. Now, if you grow up indoctrinated in what is the conventional presentation of U.S. history, and your identity rests on that, you could imagine then why, when people critically look at those presumptions, it becomes so. I think it's more than just guilt. I think it's a matter of reconceptualizing who one is in light of those realities. And so this is why when we begin to think about Black History Month, it becomes important that we understand it's not just the accumulation of facts and events. Facts and events in themselves have no meaning. Only when you clothe yourself within the context of those facts and events can you truly be clothed with an understanding of history. And so the idea then is that the interpretation of the facts becomes so important. So at one level, we have the facts, the evidence, and then at another level, we have the interpretation. And when myth is conflated with facts, then you have confusion. And so this is why when we talk about the mythic aspects to issues around race, it becomes so important. I'll give you an example. And why this becomes important, because in the Whoopi Goldberg case, the issue really lies in justification of, in my estimation, justification of the Zionist project. It had less to do with the Holocaust. It has more to do with the justification of the Zionist project, that is the state of Israel. In justifying one's beliefs, myths can be a critical part of what people embrace and thus ignore the facts. And so when you indoctrinate people a certain kind of way, as in the case of Black history, then you tend to not accept who you are because you built that identity around this mythology. So what we see in the United States, and I think that's why Whoopi was looking through a certain prism, she understood full well what it meant to be Black in the United States. And she understood that, and she didn't say she wasn't a Holocaust denier. She said it was man's inhumanity to man. So she made it very clear that it was a genocide, it was inhumane. So she wasn't denying the Holocaust as some people do, especially the Nazi types, that they deny it. She never denied that. So why is that important? That she said it wasn't about race, is because the Zionist project, on the notion that Jews are one race and therefore had the right to return, despite the fact that the indigenous people, the Palestinians, are on that land, and many have been forced out of that land and cannot return. So that's very important to understand. When they established the state of Israel, even the United Nations, when they talked about developing a two-state solution and they divided it up, the fact remains that 66% of the population in what was then Palestine were Palestinians. In fact, it's more like 69%. And the remainders were Jews in Palestine. But when they divided up the land, they gave 56% of the land to the Jews, 43% to the Palestinians. Though the Palestinians had already owned, listen to this, 92% of the land. They already owned 92, and the Jews owned less than 8%. So when they set up this so-called two-state notion, they already gave the upper hand to the Jewish invaders over the indigenous Palestinians. So you could imagine then, especially after the massacre of this village that took place just a month before Israel was declared an official state, what the state of affairs must have been, because the United Nations followed Britain. After Britain gave up its mandate, the United Nations took supervision, and that's when we have another part of Black history emerge, where Ralph Bunche becomes the mediator for what would become the state of Israel.
And we
Now,
don't hear his name a lot. We don't hear his name a lot, although I know it's been a while, but he's passed on.
yeah, well, Ralph Bunche was the first Black person to earn a PhD in political science. He went to UCLA. In fact, he played basketball there. There's a famous picture, you can find it online, of Bunche and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar standing next to each other. Bunche was one of the first Black basketball players at UCLA. He went on to earn his PhD, becoming the first African American to do so, and taught for many years at Howard University, which is a HBCU. After that, he went into working with the newly formed United Nations and ultimately became Undersecretary of the United Nations. But he was the key mediator for the war that followed in 1948 after Israel was declared a state. And so he won the Nobel Prize, becoming the first African American to do so. In fact, there's a picture of Ralph Bunche and Martin Luther King together when Martin Luther King won the Nobel Prize. And so it's that connection between African Americans who have won the Nobel Prize. But we glorify that and say, oh, he was the first to win the Nobel Peace Prize, but at what cost? And to whom's interest did he serve? And so this is why I said we have to go beyond just merely citing facts to being able to interpret history in such a fashion that we understand it in terms of its meaning. And so to have a meaningful understanding of history is more than just citing facts and events. You have to be able to have an interpretive framework to understand the context of the facts and events.
Great. And I knew you could do that. Timothy Allen says the Bible is a book of teachings. Jeannie says, thank you for your explanation. Black Alon says, are we going to discuss the role the Yiddish so-called Jews played in the transatlantic slave trade and the millions they led into slavery because they felt the African was less than that? Hold on just a minute with that. I want you to answer that, Dr. John. Victoria says, truth. Holly likes the idea that Shannon Lanier is going to come on, and she said he's a great resource. We're glad to have him on the show. Cleopatra says, I have the book too by Carter G. Woodson. She says, I'm just clapping my hands.
Thank you.
John, I can't read that writing, but it says Sister 19 LOL online. You know who that is? Victoria Strong says, Whoopi, what the Jews rather us not to talk about. Whoopi said, what the Jews rather us not talk about it. Are we going to discuss the role the Yiddish played? That, according to Nishwan Simba says, played in the transatlantic slave trade. She wants to hear about that. And can we discuss how the Jews gained outrageous wealth from the transatlantic slave trade and used the wealth to control the Germans' economy until the rise of Hitler, who put them down, and whether or not Hitler was right in his decision to do so? Okay. Our time is going by, John. So can you wrap that up?
Sure. So the first one was Okay.
Um, are we going to discuss the role the Yiddish so-called Jews played in the transatlantic slave trade and the millions they led into slavery because they felt the African was less than?
Okay.
Hmm.
How can I put this? I know the person who wrote the book on what was it entitled? The Secret. What was
Oh,
it
the
called?
secret
Uh-huh.
life, the secret life of between blacks and Jews.
Yes.
That yeah, yeah.
Yeah. That was written by Professor Tony Martin,
Mm-hmm.
who is now deceased, unfortunately.
Yeah.
He was a Garveyite. He wrote a lot of books on Marcus Garvey, which is interesting because it gets us back to this whole idea of Black Zionism. When we think in terms of the slave trade, and he wrote that book, he got a lot of responses, vicious responses for writing the book. In my estimation, in terms of the role that Jews played, they played a role, but it was not seminal. That is to say, it wasn't pivotal, it wasn't key, it wasn't as large as one would assume. I would also, in connection with that, say no, Jews did not control the German economy and what Hitler was trying to do. No, Hitler was using Jews as a scapegoat. It's very important to understand the difference. He was using Jews as a scapegoat because he wanted to establish, and he did establish, one, a fascist state. Now, you have to understand similar kinds of things happened in Italy with Mussolini, who established a fascist state and then tried to occupy Ethiopia in the mid 1930s. The same thing happened in Spain. There was, in fact, a civil war in Spain in which there was something called the Abraham Lincoln Brigade that fought on behalf of the Republicans against the fascists. The Republicans or the Republic, wanted to establish a democratic republic in Spain against the fascists. And the fascists won that. Portugal became fascist. Japan became fascist. In fact, the fascist government of Japan then tried to take over the Chinese, and Mao Zedong, who led the Communist Party to their liberation, China to their liberation in 1949. So the point is that the move towards fascism is a part of the political economy of capitalism. And when capitalism moves to concentrate its power towards the right, fascism is always a possibility. So I would not say that Jews ran the economy in Germany, but they were the scapegoats that allowed Hitler, in light of the fact that Germany had lost the first war. This is very important. Germany was defeated in World War I, and that hurt Germany in many ways, politically, militarily, and their whole position in the world. So Hitler played upon German nationalism by saying that I can restore. Let's make Germany great again. You heard that before, right?
Yeah,
let's
yeah.
let's make Germany great again. And by the way, it's no accident because Trump's father was a Nazi. He belonged to the Nazi party. There's pictures of him holding up the swastika. So that whole notion of German nationalism, just as we saw with Trump in terms of, quote, American nationalism, brings with it xenophobia, right? People outside of the country are a threat, and scapegoats, right? How often did you hear from Trump about certain groups of people being a danger to the United States and using those groups of people as scapegoats? So that when fascists attack people, what did he say? The first great conflict between fascists and anti-fascists, there's good people on both sides. Because he was a fascist who is trying to move, and we know what happened January 6th. I won't go all into that, but the point I'm
Yeah.
trying to make is that fascism was in Germany was an attempt on the part of Hitler to take that country to another level. And he utilized German nationalism, and Jews were a scapegoat. Yes, there was some participation of Jews in the transatlantic slave trade, but they were not the preeminent group in that process.
Interesting thought. As we get ready to wrap up the program, Victoria Strong, she reiterated the book is called The Secret Relationship Between Blacks and Jews. And I can remember back in the 90s, I led a group with Dr. Vibert White, member of Nation of Islam, uh, on that discussion in that book. And we got a nice little front page picture and story about that because it upset a lot of people in the city, the secret relationship between Blacks and Jews. So, hey, what do you consider a great role in the transatlantic slave trade where the Jews funded a great majority of the slave ships and flesh pirates?
That's not true.
Okay.
There was some Jewish participation in the transatlantic slave trade. I'm not denying that. What I'm saying is that in terms of the percentages and the preeminent role, it wasn't Jews. And I tell you, part of that was also due to the fact, and this is where this question about racial intolerance plays a part in this whole story about Jews, the Holocaust, and the rest, right? Because Jews, there was racial intolerance and discrimination, not racial, there was religious discrimination and intolerance towards Jews in the United States, even during slavery. So we're clear about that. But some Jews wanted to assimilate, and the assimilated Jews found it quite convenient to identify as a white person because Jews do not have a particular phenotype. That's very important to understand. When most people say Jews have a certain phenotype, they look a certain kind of way, they're actually referring to certain Jews from certain parts of the world that have a similar phenotype because they're from the same, ethnic groups in that part of the world. But there's no Jewish phenotype. It so happens that many of the Jews who came to the United States came from Eastern Europe. And therefore, a lot of those had, similar phenotypical features, but there's no Jewish phenotype. And
So are you a Jew because of your religion? Are you a Jewish person because of your race, your mother, your father? Because it
yeah.
leads one to wonder.
Well, there's a lot of doctrine around that, right? The doctrine generally is that one identifies as a Jew based upon who your mother is. There are some Jews who, and they're a minority, who say it can be either or both. But most Jews argue that if your mother is a Jew, then you're a Jew. Think about somebody like one of the most important Black historians in the 20th century, Arthur Schomburg, of which the Schomburg Research Center is named after, right in Harlem, New York. He was a Jew. He was a Puerto Rican Jew. So, is there a certain, identity that we can say when we look at Arthur Schomburg, who played a very important role in advancing what we know as Black history, who had the largest collection of Black historical literature in the world and then sold it to the New York Public Library? We have the Schomburg Center today, who taught people such as John Henry Clark and others. So what I'm trying to get at is that when we talk about Judaism, you have to understand it has a complexity whereby a religious belief system integrates into various cultures and they become entwined. This is why when we talked about Dr. Ben Yakinen, he had a debate with a member of the Jewish, the Anti-Defamation League, ADL. And you can see that online. It was done under the auspices of the show Like It Is in New York. And this guy used to have a very good talk show that was very famous. And Dr. Ben debates this guy from ADL who wanted to claim that Dr. Ben was anti-Semitic. And Dr. Ben says, how can you call me anti-Semitic when in fact I'm a Jew? Right? And they were debating, he was debating the point that many of the European Jews carried a racist attitude towards people who were Jews of African descent. And that's what that debate was about.
Indeed. Uh,
So,
I'm sorry. Want to wrap this up. Bunky says Jewish people are Khazars. White Jews come from a made up religion and identity. That's what Bunky says. I'll give you a chance to comment on this Dr. John. Brittany says, but is it important to recognize that not all Jewish people are religious? There is a cultural connection as well. And Nuwasu Simba says, a mulatto looks like a mulatto. That has no bearing here. They had been raping women from the time they came into and went out of West Africa. And FBA says, are the true Hebrew Israelites? That's why everybody hates who we really are. So
yeah,
I know it's a lot. That's a lot to put into a couple minutes.
sure,
We're past time, but
sure,
Nate, we got to. If you could let us hold over just a minute, we want to wrap this up neatly.
sure. One of the issues that always centers around when you talk about who is what with regard to identity is a very critical question of authenticity. Authenticity. That's why in my book, Black Christology and the Quest for Authenticity. And that deals with this whole question about whether Jesus was black. And so I go into that. The importance about the authenticity issue is that who you talk to will lead to different kinds of conclusions as to who is authentically something. I had an uncle who was a Baptist minister, and he was formerly a Methodist, and he always claimed that the Methodists were inauthentic Christians because they sprinkled the water rather than immersed in the water. What's an authentic Christian? So for my uncle, if you wasn't baptized, just sprinkling some water over somebody's head meant you weren't a Christian. So when we talk about authenticity with respect to Judaism, we have to be clear that the presumptions about what is authentic and inauthentic is always based upon where you are in the spectrum of Jewish ideas and theology and culture. Now, there are some Jews, in Britain, you're right, there are some Jews who do not practice the religion, but culturally see themselves as Jews. So there's a cultural dimension, but that's the same with any religion, right? There's a cultural dimension. If you talk to Black Christians, there's a guy who's written a very good book called Black But Not Baptist, right? And my wife just encountered a woman the other day while she was doing business who asked her, do you believe in Jesus? Now, when you think about that, from a cultural standpoint, for some people, if you're Black, you have to believe in Jesus. That's a part of your Black identity, right? And then there are other Black people who are atheists, who are humanists. So does that determine the authenticity of one's Blackness by what your religious beliefs may or may not be? Well, for some people, that's the case. So when we look at the question of culture and religion, we always find that religions emerge in a cultural context. And so if that cultural context shapes such a way in which you may even leave the religion in the formal sense, but maintain the culture. So we find that there's some Jews who are what they call non-practicing Jews who identify as Jews, such as you find non-practicing Christians who don't go to church and all that, but still proclaim themselves to be Christians. There's some people who says They don't believe in organized religion. They believe in something called spirituality. So, what we have to understand then is that the complexity of culture in relationship to religion will lead to many different responses. This is why in our community, you will find loads of little churches, no more than 10 to 15 people on every corner,
Yes.
right? And all
Yes.
of them have differences as to who is authentically Christian or whatever that religious group is. So we shouldn't get caught in the bind of authenticity. As Black people, we have to be concerned with how we gain autonomy. And when we think about autonomy, we're talking about gaining the power of self-determination. I'd like to end with this one comment because I think this is an important summation for Black History Month. And it goes, the status of a public celebrity should not be the gauge for measuring one's importance in matters of history. So when we think about that, it's not a matter of one's public celebrity that determines the importance of one in terms of matters of history. So we have to look at history from the bottom up rather than the top down. Thank you.
I will say amen to that.
Yeah.
Brittany wants to know, is this discussion recorded and made available? Absolutely. Cincinnati Digital Media will have this ready and online, and you can go to Cincinnati Digital Media on Facebook.com, and it will be available today. And it definitely will be on my page, Edna Howe Parish, Straight Talk Live, and you can get it, and it is free. Somebody also wants to know, who told you Jesus is part of the Black identity? We have to get past the mythology of mulattoes. Don't even try to answer that, Dr. John. We can't
I'm
even
not
go
going to go
there.
there.
Yeah, and then somebody wants to know the name of the book you wrote and where can she purchase it. So I guess she was talking about the Black Christology and
Yeah.
yeah.
The title of the book is Black Christology and the Quest for Authenticity, a Philosophical Appraisal. And that's published by Lexington Books, and it was published in 2019.
Okay, and what's your Instagram in case people want to check out some other issues and get other information about your books and your
Yes.
classes that you teach at Michigan State?
The Instagram account is the McClendon Report. And I have some very brilliant young people who are putting that together. In fact, we had a meeting this past Friday, and I have to say, my knowledge of all this is very minimal, and they have taken the ball and created the McClendon Report. I should say this, if I may, Edna, that the idea of the McClendon Report comes from my association with Miss Edna Howe Parrish. I had a newspaper column, excuse me, in the Sophisticator that she was the editor of, and my column was called the McClendon Report. Later, I had a community TV show in Dayton, Ohio, under the name The McClendon Report. So the current Instagram, the McClendon Report, has its roots going all the way back to the illustrious Miss Edna Howe Parrish.
Well, thank you so much for that, John. I really appreciate that. Final thought: Bengals today or Rams? Uh-huh. Football? You watching?
No, I'm not watching. I'm
Okay.
boycotting NFL football in support of Kaepernick. I
Absolutely.
haven't watched football in what? Over
9 months.
2 years? Yeah.
Yeah, a couple years. Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, that's a good thing. We thank you so much. Whoopi Goldberg was right and she was wrong. And hopefully her faux pas made for a great discussion. And an opportunity to educate us again on some of these issues and to bring out good information and good people to talk about it. John, we'll see you next quarter here on Straight
Okay.
Talk Live. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
And thank you, Cincinnati Digital Media. And thank you all for listening. I'm Edna Hal Parrish.